All right, guys. I just wanted to chime in and provide just some feedback on a lot of the very consistent themes. First of all, in regards to our civil liberties discussion, in regards to freedom of speech, there's a reason why I asked this question in the way that I did in this current time, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But a lot of really good content here, a lot of common assumptions that are really close to being accurate, but the purpose of what I'm doing right now is just to kind of lay out some basics that are commonly misunderstood by people about freedom of speech. It is becoming explosive right now, given what is going on with Twitter and the president's account being banned by Twitter and different things like that. So I want to go through some basics about some things like what does and does not apply to freedom of speech that a lot of people don't understand. Okay, so number one, when it comes to freedom of speech, the First Amendment. Okay, your protections for freedom of speech really only apply to government action. Okay, so there is a big difference between saying something and going to jail for saying something and saying something and losing your job for saying something. Okay, so if you go back to the clear and present danger test, which was covered in the text, okay, a lot of people go back to that as sort of the one of the first major interpretations by the Supreme Court regarding freedom of speech. You know, where you talk about you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. The clear and present danger test talks about the ability of Congress to have a right to limit, freedom of speech if it tends to lead to a conflict that Congress has the authority or the desire to prevent. Okay, so when they talk about what does it mean when you say you can't yell fire in a crowded theater? Well, you have freedom of speech, correct? Like you can go into a theater, you can talk, you have freedom of speech. But if you stand up and you yell fire in a crowded theater and 200 people rush towards a door because you yelled fire in a crowded theater, and let's say that somebody gets trampled and they die, well, you would be liable for that action, especially considering that if you did it and there was no fire. Okay. Um, you cannot say bomb on a plane. Okay. A lot of people would argue, I can say whatever I want. It's freedom of speech. But freedom of speech has context, especially when in regards to government action. Now, a lot of what is going on now has to do with this sort of misunderstanding by a lot of people that you have free speech protections within the private sector. Businesses can fire you for your speech anytime they want. Okay. And I like to give this example. There's lots of examples of it, but back in about 15 years ago or so, Rush Limbaugh, who is a nationally syndicated conservative talk show host, he went on to he actually had a gig for a little while where he was commenting on NFL games, and he was doing an NFL pregame show where he was talking about and he made a comment. He was commenting on sports, and I've never really quite understood why exactly he was brought on, but he was commenting on sports, and they he started making comments that the only reason why the NFL commentators were talking about Donovan McNabb was because he was an African American quarterback. Um, that was viewed as a racist statement, and he lost his job. Okay, Rush Limbaugh was never on that NFL program again. ESPN is a private company. Rush Limbaugh made statements which he had a right to do, but they ran in contrast to what that company was willing to tolerate, and they fired him. Is this a violation of his freedom of speech? No, it is not. It is a private company. Um, so this is a really big distinction. And when you listen to people talk about freedom of speech, this is one of the biggest things they don't understand. There's a difference between your freedom of speech in regards to actions by the government, and there's a difference between freedom of speech um, when it comes to the private sector. Okay. Um, you can say, but freedom of speech also has context as well. So the clear and present danger test, you know, was established in the early 1900s. Then in 1969, you get what replaces it, which is called Brandenburg, which is a court case called Brandenburg versus Ohio. And I want to talk about this for a moment because it deals with something called imminent lawless action. And imminent lawless action is really, really important to understand, especially within the context of what happened in the Capitol. Okay. Um, so a lot of people think that there is a hate speech exemption in the First Amendment. There is no hate speech exemption in the First Amendment. People can and do have a right to say hateful and racist things. To quote the Supreme Court, one of the bedrock principles of the First Amendment is basically that you cannot limit speech based on content just because minority section of the population finds it disreputable or offensive. Um, when it comes to political speech specifically, the Supreme Court is incredibly protective. If you look at the court case you hopefully have reviewed by now, Texas versus Johnson, where Johnson was arrested for burning a flag outside of the Republican National Convention in Texas in 1984. A Supreme Court decision comes down in 1989. That was ruled protected political symbolic speech, free expressive speech. Okay. So many Americans find the burning of the flag to be incredibly offensive. Okay. But that was ruled to be protected political speech. Okay. Because if you start curbing speech based on content, here's the slippery slope that people on both the left and the right of the political spectrum are afraid of. If you start limiting speech based on content, who gets to determine what content is and is not acceptable? Okay. Now it gets more complicated when you start dealing with imminent lawless action. So in 1969, Brandon Berg was essentially a Ku Klux Klan leader, and he was up on stage giving a speech filled with rhetoric and talking about overthrowing the government, different things like that. And it was racist, as you would expect in such a scenario. And he was arrested for this speech, and the case goes before the Supreme Court. And this is where the court draws a distinction between, you know, somebody just getting up on stage and kind of spewing rhetoric and somebody getting up on stage and spewing rhetoric with an understanding that the rhetoric that they are spewing, the hate speech, the racist speech, whatever, that the rhetoric that they are spewing has a likelihood that it will actually happen. Okay? And this is where what happened in the Capitol last weekend, or a few weeks back on January 6th, this is why many people, well, it's the reason why Trump has now been impeached for a second time. First president in American history to be impeached twice by the House of Representatives. And we haven't quite discussed that in the course yet. The material hasn't covered it yet. But one thing you need to understand about impeachment does not necessarily mean removal from office. Impeachment means you have been convicted by the House, and Trump has now been convicted by the House of Representatives twice. He has not been convicted by the Senate twice. Therefore, he has not been removed from office. So impeachment and actually being removed from office are not the same thing. Okay, just to be very clear about that, since we haven't quite discussed that yet. There's a very serious discussion to be had as to whether or not what the president did on January 6th, his speech before the riots at the Capitol, did that fall under free? Was the words that he was using, did that incite the mob? Would that not be protected under this imminent lawless action doctrine? And the House of Representatives clearly feels like he incited the mob, and the House of Representatives therefore has indicted him and impeached him again for those actions. But that is where free speech starts to get hazy. If you, when it comes to imminent lawless action, was it obvious that the rhetoric you were using was going to lead to the result? So this is an example I give, and maybe it helps clarify it for some of you, maybe it does not. But, there is a difference between getting up on stage and saying, I can't stand the government is terrible, we should rise up together and overthrow the government. And then you get off stage and the people in the audience who love what you're saying are cheering and saying, yeah, that's great, blah, blah, blah. There's a difference between that and getting up on stage and saying, we should go overthrow the government. Who's coming with me? I've got a truckload of explosives in the back and a map of the White House, and let's go. Okay. Those are two examples of speech. One isn't like the first one, where it's mainly rhetoric and there's no real intent of doing anything. Um, that's the first example. Okay, that is more than likely going to be protected free speech. Okay, that's not violating any laws. That is political speech. That kind of is right there on the line. It's not a directed threat. Okay. However, the second one, where there is a strong likelihood that the words you are using are likely to bring about the results they propose, okay, that is where you start getting into imminent lawless action, and that is where you can start getting into legitimate trouble. Um, the president, for example, has had his Twitter account removed by Twitter. Think to yourselves, should is that fair to the president? Is it not? Well, this once again falls under the difference between government action and private action. Okay. Twitter is a private company that has a right to control the content on its platform. And in the end, this really hurts Twitter because Donald Trump had 85 million followers, I think, at some point, or 75 million followers at one point. So this actually hurts their traffic. It hurts ad revenue. It hurts all kinds of things. Okay. So, but they made the decision to take him off of Twitter. Okay. They're a private company. That is not a violation of his freedom of speech. Another example that is incredibly controversial right now for in regards to freedom of speech, there is a conservative app called Parler, and that is where when Twitter started censoring rhetoric that they deemed to be misinformation or aggressive, hateful speech and different things like that, certain factions of the political right in this country went to a new app called Parler where they concentrated. It was basically all conservatives that were very upset about the election, etc. And the rhetoric got very, very intense. Much of the activity that you saw on January 6th was planned, discussed, and organized in some way on Parler. And so the servers who host Parler kicked it off their platform. So this was Amazon. Amazon kicked them off their platform. I think they were taken out of the Google Play Store, etc., because those companies did not want their content on their platform. This is where the whole issue of censorship and everything gets very complicated in the age of the internet, because in the age of the internet, these major companies control the pathway to having a voice to a certain extent because they control the servers. If you get kicked off of these out of these stores, you are more limited on your ability to reach people. Now, this is true and it isn't true. You know, there are ways around this, but it's more difficult. Anybody, for example, you can funnel people to your website and communicate that way. And, nobody's really taking every website down. You just can't be on YouTube, for example. Those are private companies. If you're going to deal in certain types of rhetoric, people like Alex Jones, who have had very controversial YouTube channels, those have been taken down. YouTube is owned by Google. It is a private company. It can determine what content it wants on its platform. Okay, so there has been a lot of really good discussion. I've been reading through these across multiple classes, and I just wanted to hit on these major themes. Um, and I wanted to ask you guys, and feel free to continue to add if you would like to the forum, and I will continue to monitor it because civil liberties, which is the chapter we're doing this week, and civil rights, which is the chapter we are doing next week, and I'm going to be putting the material up very shortly. These two chapters very much run together, and so I'm gonna this forum can kind of stay up for a little bit. There will be a forum next week to continue to discuss some of these issues. And very shortly, I'm going to be launching a blogger forum where it will exist outside of Top Hat, and you can just simply go there to ask questions, and I will be responding to that as well, just to kind of centralize things. But I hope that helps clarify some of these issues. If there is an issue that you guys, in the meantime, before the blogger site comes up, if there are issues that you would like for me to clarify, especially before the exam, please feel free to email me a direct question and I will put together a video like this to respond in mass to as many of you as possible. I hope this has been helpful. Please let me know what you think. And I am curious now that I've explained it a little bit more for you. How many of you think that the internet changes the game in regards to free speech protections and censorship? I think there's a very intelligent discussion to be had about the dangers that mass misinformation, which we will cover this more in later chapters, but the dangers that mass misinformation um, present. And I think we saw that on January 6th, because I say this not as a political statement, but there is literally zero evidence whatsoever that the election was stolen. But we have numerous outlets out there, major news organizations that have, and major news contributors who have continued to um, really put forth false and misleading information that the election was stolen, that the voting machines were rigged, and this has kind of worked its way from more extreme elements of media and has gone into the mainstream. Um, One thing that I always promise my students in my classes is that I will try to present nothing but truth to you, in fact. And the simple fact is that the Trump legal team went into court over 60 times and literally presented zero evidence that a court was willing to accept about voter fraud. Now, were there a few people here and there who may have cheated, etc., in different states? Of course, that happens in every single election. But as far as this narrative that the election was somehow stolen, there has been zero credible evidence produced. And it is also important to note that the Trump legal team, whether it be Sidney Powell, Jenna Ellis, Rudy Giuliani, any of them, when they actually got before a judge and were under oath, as far as what they were bringing into the courtroom, they never once claimed that there was fraud in front of a judge, and they never once produced substantive evidence of fraud before a judge. The rest of it was just media rhetoric, and it's unfortunate, and it brings about a conversation about what do we do about misinformation. So let me know your thoughts. You can add on below, but I'm going to distribute this via Remind to everybody. And please let me know what you think. Feel free to email me with any comments, and maybe we can take the discussion to the new Blogger platform and advance it and continue to advance it as we go through the semester. Thank you. Hope everybody has a great weekend.